The splash echoed across the water like a gunshot, and Daniel stood frozen on the riverbank, watching his mother's wheelchair disappear beneath the surface, while high above an eagle circled once and let out a cry that sounded exactly like judgment. Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. If you're ready for a story that will shake you to your core, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I'm bringing you another tale of redemption that you absolutely cannot miss. Today's story is about a son's ultimate betrayal, a mother's unbreakable spirit, and the eagle that witnessed justice unfold. Now let us begin. The marble floors of Daniel's penthouse gleamed under the morning sun, streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, but he barely noticed the beauty spread before him, the city sprawling like a kingdom he owned piece by piece. Instead, his attention fixed on the documents scattered across his glass desk, property valuations, medical reports, and a lawyer's estimate that made his pulse quicken with something that wasn't quite excitement, but wasn't quite guilt either. 73 years old, he murmured, tapping his Mont Blanc pen against the medical summary. Severe rheumatoid arthritis, limited mobility, increasing dependency. Each clinical phrase felt like a stepping stone toward the inheritance that would finally make him whole, or so he told himself. He pushed the thought away and reached for his phone, scrolling through contacts until he found Riverside Assisted Living. His thumb hovered over the call button. One conversation, one signature from his mother, and the family estate, worth $12 million in today's market, would fund the expansion he needed. The expansion that would prove, once and for all, that he'd surpassed his father's legacy. But he didn't call, not yet. 20 miles away, in the family mansion that had sheltered 3 generations of Harrington children, Rose sat in her wheelchair before the bay window that overlooked the gardens she could no longer tend. Sunlight caught the silver in her hair, transforming it into something luminous, but her hands, once strong enough to lift crying babies and stubborn husbands, now trembled as she held a photograph. The picture showed Daniel at 7, grass-stained and grinning, holding up a painted rock he'd found by the river. "It looks like a heart, Mama," his younger self proclaimed. She could still hear the joy in his voice, still feel the warmth of his small hand in hers as they'd walked the riverside path together, collecting treasures that meant nothing to anyone but them. Rose's wheelchair creaked as she shifted, adjusting the blanket across her legs. The rheumatoid arthritis had stolen her mobility gradually, like a thief working in darkness, but it hadn't touched her memory or her heart. She remembered every birthday cake she'd baked, every scraped knee she'd kissed, every proud moment when Daniel had achieved something wonderful. The love remained constant, even as the distance between them grew. Mrs. Harrington, Elena, her live-in caregiver, appeared in the doorway with gentle eyes and coffee that smelled like comfort. "Your son called. He's coming for lunch tomorrow." Rose's heart lifted despite herself. Did he say why? Elena's hesitation lasted only a heartbeat, but Rose caught it. After 40 years of reading people's students, parents, her own family, she recognized the pause that preceded difficult news. "He mentioned wanting to discuss your living situation." The photograph slipped from Rose's fingers, floating to the hardwood floor. She didn't need Elena to explain further. The living situation conversation had been circling like a vulture for months. Assisted living facilities, medical care, the burden she'd apparently become. "Of course," Rose whispered, her voice steady despite the fracture spreading through her chest. "Tell him I'll make his favorite. Does he still like lemon cake?" Elena knelt to retrieve the fallen photograph, her expression soft with sympathy. "I'm sure he does." But Rose wasn't sure of anything anymore. She wasn't sure when her son had stopped seeing her as his mother and started seeing her as an obstacle. She wasn't sure when love had become logistics, when family had become burden. Most troubling of all, she wasn't sure what she would say when he arrived tomorrow with his papers and his practiced explanations about why leaving her childhood home was for the best. As Elena bustled away to prepare lunch, Rose wheeled herself closer to the window. Beyond the glass, the river glittered in the distance, the same water where she'd taught Daniel to skip stones, where they'd fed ducks on summer afternoons, where he'd promised her he'd always take care of her when she got old. She closed her eyes and made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. Tomorrow, when Daniel came with his plans and his papers, she would suggest they take a drive to the river. One last visit to the place where they'd been happiest before everything changed forever. Miles away, Daniel finally made the call to Riverside Assisted Living, scheduling a tour for the following week. As he hung up, he caught his reflection again in the window, and this time the hollow-eyed man staring back looked exactly like what he was, a son about to betray the person who'd loved him most. Neither of them knew that by tomorrow evening, the river would become the stage for something that would either destroy them completely or force them to remember what family really meant. What do you think drives people to prioritize money over family bonds? Have you ever seen someone change dramatically when inheritance is involved? Share your thoughts below. The riverside parking area was empty, except for Daniel's black Mercedes and the old wooden bench where he'd pushed his mother's wheelchair. Rose had insisted on this location for their discussion, and something in her voice, a quiet steel he hadn't heard in years, had made him reluctant to refuse. Now, watching her gaze across the water with an expression he couldn't read, he wished he'd simply handled everything through lawyers. Daniel's jaw tightened as he adjusted his tie, an unnecessary gesture that betrayed his discomfort. The manila folder in his hands contained everything: facility brochures, medical care plans, financial arrangements. Clean, logical, final. "Mother, we need to discuss. You caught your first fish right there." She pointed to a spot where the current created gentle eddies around a fallen log. "Threw it back because you said it looked scared." That was a long time ago. The words came out sharper than he'd intended. Things change. People change. "Yes," Rose agreed, turning her wheelchair to face him fully. "They do." Above them, unnoticed by either, a golden eagle settled on the highest branch of an ancient oak, its keen eyes fixed on the scene below with an intensity that seemed almost deliberate. Daniel opened the folder, the papers rustling like autumn leaves. Riverside Assisted Living has an excellent reputation. 24-hour medical care, activities, social opportunities. You'd be much happier there, much safer. Safer than what? Than alone in that big house. Elena can't be there every second, and what if something happens? What if you fall, or have a medical emergency? His voice gained momentum, each word carefully calculated to sound like concern rather than convenience. The the estate maintenance costs are astronomical. Heating, repairs, property taxes. Rose's voice carried a note of recognition that made Daniel's stomach clench. "There's what?" "The truth." She folded her hands in her lap with deliberate calm. "This isn't about my safety, Daniel. This is about your inheritance." The afternoon sun slanted through the trees, casting long shadows that seemed to divide the ground between them. Daniel's grip on the folder tightened until his knuckles went white. "That's not, you're twisting this. Sentiment doesn't pay medical bills. Neither does greed disguised as concern." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. He took a step back, then another, his breath coming shallow and quick. 38 years of being the golden child, the successful son, the pride of the family, and she saw right through him, to the hollow core he'd been trying to fill with other people's approval. "I'm not greedy," he said, but his voice cracked on the words. "I'm practical. I'm thinking ahead. When you're gone, that house will just sit there, empty, worthless. When I'm gone," Rose repeated the phrase quietly. Not if, when. Is that what you're waiting for, Daniel? For me to die so you can finally have what you really want? Stop it. Is that why you've been so distant? So cold? Because looking at me reminds you that I'm not dying fast enough for your plans? I said stop it. The folder exploded from his hands, papers scattering in the breeze like wounded birds. Financial projections and facility brochures danced across the grass, and several pages fluttered toward the water's edge. Rose watched the papers fall with an expression of profound sadness. Your father would be... Don't. Daniel's voice dropped to something dangerous. Don't you dare tell me what he would think? He would be ashamed. The words landed like a slap. Daniel felt something snap inside his chest, a string that had been pulled too tight for too long, finally breaking under the weight of his own guilt and fury. His hands shook as he gripped the handles of his mother's wheelchair. Fine, he whispered, his voice barely audible above the gentle lapping of water against the shore. You want to talk about shame? You want to sit here and judge me? Let's see how righteous you feel when you understand what helpless really means. He began to push. The wheelchair moved slowly at first, gravel crunching under the wheels as Rose gripped the armrests. Daniel, what are you doing? Showing you reality. His voice had gone hollow, mechanical. Showing you what happens when you're completely dependent on someone who's tired of carrying the burden. The chair picked up speed as the ground sloped toward the water. Rose's voice rose in panic. Daniel, stop, please. But something had broken loose in Daniel's mind, some dam that had held back years of resentment and self-loathing. He pushed harder. His expensive shoes sliding on the grass as momentum took over. The wheelchair was moving too fast now, headed straight for the wooden dock that jutted out over the deepest part of the river. Daniel! Rose's scream cut through the air like a knife, raw and terrified. 20 feet from the dock, Daniel suddenly realized what he was doing, truly realized, as if waking from a nightmare. His hands flew to the wheelchair handles, trying to stop, to pull back, but physics had taken over. The chair's weight and speed overwhelmed his panicked attempts to brake. Time stretched like taffy. Rose's silver hair caught the sunlight as her wheelchair rolled onto the wooden dock. The planks groaned under the weight. Daniel stumbled, falling to his knees on the grass, still reaching desperately for the chair that was now beyond his grasp. High above, the eagle spread its wings and released a cry that pierced the afternoon air, a sound like judgment, like witness, like the voice of every moral law Daniel had just shattered. The wheelchair hit the dock's edge with a sickening thud. Rose's voice, calling his name one last time, was swallowed by the splash that followed. Daniel knelt on the riverbank, staring at the widening circles on the water's surface, understanding with perfect clarity that he had just crossed a line from which there might be no return. The eagle circled once overhead, its shadow passing over the scattered papers that bore his mother's name, then disappeared into the deepening sky. Have you ever seen someone make a choice in anger that they immediately regretted? What do you think drives people to such breaking points? Let us know in the comments below. The silence after the splash stretched for exactly 17 seconds. Daniel would remember this detail with crystalline clarity for the rest of his life, the way trauma burns certain moments into memory with surgical precision. 17 seconds of staring at concentric circles spreading across the river's surface while his brain performed elaborate gymnastics to avoid processing what his hands had just done. She fell. The wheelchair malfunctioned. The brake gave out. The lies assembled themselves with desperate efficiency, each one a small bandage over the gaping wound of truth. Daniel's legs moved without conscious command, carrying him to the dock's edge where he could see the wheelchair's chrome catching sunlight beneath 3 feet of murky water. But no Rose. No, no, no. The words tumbled from his lips like a prayer to a god he'd stopped believing in years ago. His expensive suit felt suddenly tight, constricting, as if the fabric itself was judging him. "This isn't, I didn't." Rose's silver head broke the surface, her mouth gasping for air, her arms moving in the awkward but determined strokes of someone who'd learned to swim in this very river 60 years ago. Her soaked cardigan clung to her thin frame as she fought against the current, and Daniel felt his carefully constructed denial crumble like sand. She was alive. She was swimming. She was looking directly at him, with eyes that held something far worse than anger, disappointment so profound it seemed to have its own gravity. "Help me," she called, her voice steady despite the water lapping at her chin. Not pleading, not begging, simply stating what a son should do for his mother. Daniel stood frozen on the dock, his hands gripping the railing until splinters bit into his palms. "Move, call 911, jump in, do something, anything." But his body had become a stranger to him, operated by a mind that was busy rewriting history even as it unfolded. She was being unreasonable. She forced this confrontation. She chose to come here, to this emotionally loaded place, to manipulate me with guilt and memory. "Daniel," Rose's voice carried across the water with the authority she'd once used to call him in for dinner, to stop him from hitting his sister, to ground him after he'd crashed his first car. The branch. A fallen willow branch extended from the far bank almost to where she treaded water. If she could reach it, she could pull herself to shallow water, but her arthritic hands were already showing the strain of keeping her afloat. Daniel's feet finally moved, but not toward the water. Instead, he backed away from the dock's edge, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. "I can't swim," he heard himself say, the lie falling from his lips with practiced ease. "I never learned. You know that." It was a ridiculous fabrication. Rose had taught him to swim in this very river when he was 6, but it gave him something to hide behind, some excuse for standing there while his mother fought for her life. Rose's expression shifted, and for a moment Daniel saw something flicker across her face that looked almost like pity. Not for herself, drowning in the water he'd pushed her into, but for him, standing safe and dry on the dock, drowning in lies of his own making. "Of course you can't," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly across the water. The words hit him like a physical blow. She knew. She knew he was lying, knew he was choosing to let her struggle, knew that her son, the boy she'd raised, loved, sacrificed for, was capable of standing by while she drowned rather than face what he'd done. Above them, the eagle had returned, perching on a dead branch that overhung the water. Its golden eyes moved between Daniel and Rose with an intelligence that seemed almost supernatural, as if it were taking notes, gathering evidence, preparing testimony for some cosmic court. Daniel watched from the dock, his mind spinning out justifications like a slot machine. "She's fine. She's managing. She doesn't need my help. This was an accident. I was trying to stop the chair. The ground was slippery. Anyone could have lost control." But even as the excuses multiplied, another part of his brain, the part that sounded disturbingly like his father, asked a simple question: what kind of man watches his disabled mother pull herself from a river and calls it an accident? "Shut up," Daniel whispered to the voice, to the eagle, to the universe that seemed suddenly aligned against him. "Just shut up." Rose had reached the shallows now, dragging herself onto a narrow strip of muddy beach. Her cardigan was ruined, her gray slacks torn, her carefully styled hair plastered to her skull. She looked small and fragile and utterly defeated, except for her eyes, which burned with something Daniel couldn't quite identify. Not rage, not even hurt, something colder and more final. "Daniel," she called across the water, her voice carrying with perfect clarity, "come help me back to the car." It wasn't a request, it was a test. Daniel's hands shook as he pulled out his phone. "I'm calling 911, he announced, loud enough for her to hear. "You need medical attention. This was a terrible accident." Rose laughed. Actually laughed. A sound devoid of humor that made Daniel's skin crawl. "Yes," she said, wringing water from her cardigan with movements that seemed almost meditative. "I suppose it was." But they both knew better, and somewhere in the distance, Daniel could swear he heard the eagles cry again, a sound like judgment deferred but not forgotten. The sirens were already approaching when Daniel realized that some lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. And some witnesses, whether human or otherwise, never forgot what they'd seen. The emergency room at Riverside Medical Center hummed with the controlled chaos of a Tuesday afternoon, beeping monitors, squeaking gurneys, and the clinical efficiency of people who'd seen every kind of human disaster. Daniel sat in the plastic chair beside Rose's bed, his designer suit still damp with river water and his hands folded so tightly in his lap that his knuckles had gone white. He'd jumped in after the paramedics arrived. Not to save her, Rose had already saved herself, but to maintain the fiction that he was a concerned son who'd done everything possible during a tragic accident. The performance had been flawless, frantic calls to 911, desperate attempts to reach her from the dock, finally plunging into the water when help arrived to assist. "Mild hypothermia," Dr. Sarah Chen announced, pulling back the curtain with the brisk authority of someone who delivered 10,000 diagnoses. "Some bruising on her legs and arms, but nothing serious. Mrs. Harrington, you're remarkably fortunate. At your age, with your condition, a fall like that could have been—" "I didn't fall," Rose interrupted quietly, her eyes fixed on the ceiling tiles. The words hung in the sanitized air like an accusation waiting for judgment. Dr. Chen's pen stopped moving across the chart, and Daniel felt his carefully constructed world begin to tilt. "I'm sorry?" Dr. Chen's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone trained to navigate family dynamics without taking sides. Daniel's laugh came out strangled, desperate. "She's confused. The shock, the cold water, she doesn't remember clearly. It was an accident. The wheelchair brake must have failed, and when I tried to stop it—" "Mother, please." Daniel reached for her hand, but she pulled it away with surprising strength. "You're not thinking clearly. The trauma—" "My mind is perfectly clear." Rose finally turned to look at him, and Daniel saw something in her eyes that made his stomach drop. Not the broken despair he'd expected, but a kind of terrible clarity. Perhaps clearer than it's been in years. Dr. Chen glanced between them, her expression carefully professional. "I think we should involve social services, Mrs. Harrington, if you're alleging abuse." "No." Rose's voice cut through the suggestion with surprising firmness. "No. Social services. No police. This is a family matter." Daniel felt a flood of relief so intense it made him dizzy, but it was quickly replaced by confusion. Why was she protecting him? After what he'd done, why wasn't she screaming for justice, demanding his arrest, telling the world what kind of monster he really was? However, Rose continued, turning her steady gaze back to Daniel, "I won't be returning to the house tonight, or any night, until certain things are resolved." "The Riverside Inn has accessible rooms," Daniel heard himself say, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. I'll book her a suite, whatever she needs." Rose's eyebrows rose slightly. "How generous!" The sarcasm in her voice made him flinch, but he pressed on. "I'll stay there too. To make sure you're comfortable, to help with anything you need. To make sure I don't talk to anyone about what really happened. To take care of you," Daniel said. And for a moment he almost believed it, because that's what family does. Rose was quiet for so long that Daniel began to sweat despite the hospital's air conditioning. Finally she spoke. "I don't know yet." It wasn't the reassurance Daniel had hoped for, but it wasn't a condemnation either. Dr. Chen seemed satisfied enough to begin discharge preparations, leaving them alone behind the thin curtain with their shared lie and unspoken truths. "Why?" Daniel whispered once the doctor's footsteps had faded. "Why didn't you tell them?" Rose adjusted her hospital gown, her movements careful and deliberate. "Because," she said quietly, "I want to understand what happened to my son. The boy I raised would never, could never." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Maybe you didn't know him as well as you thought." Maybe. Rose's voice carried a sadness that made Daniel's chest ache. Or maybe something broke him along the way, and his mother was too blind to see it. Outside the window, Daniel caught a glimpse of golden wings as the eagle, the same one from the river, he was somehow certain, settled on the hospital's flagpole. It seemed to be watching the emergency room entrance with the patience of a creature that had all the time in the world. "The Riverside Inn," Rose said eventually. "2 rooms, adjoining, but separate." And Daniel, "Yes? If you ever touch me in anger again, I will tell everyone what you did today. Social services, the police, your business partners, every person who ever respected the Harrington name. Do you understand?" "Good. Now help me to the wheelchair. It seems we have some things to work through." As Daniel wheeled his mother toward the hospital exit, he caught sight of their reflection in the glass doors, a son pushing his mother's chair, the picture of filial devotion. From the outside, they looked like family. The eagle watched them load into the taxi with eyes that missed nothing, then spread its wings and followed at a distance, as if it had appointed itself guardian of some cosmic justice that was still unfolding. What would you do if a family member betrayed your trust completely? Is forgiveness always possible, or are some actions unforgivable? Share your thoughts below. The Riverside Inn's honeymoon suite felt like a mockery, all warm wood paneling and romantic river views, as Daniel wheeled Rose through the door. He'd booked the most expensive accommodation available, as if luxury could somehow compensate for attempted filicide, as if thread count could balance the scales of justice. Rose surveyed the space with the analytical eye of someone who'd once managed a household, a business and a family with equal competence. "Excessive," she murmured, "but it will do." Daniel set her overnight bag on the king-sized bed, his movements stiff and mechanical. "There's a roll-in shower, accessible everything. I had them stock the refrigerator with your medications." "How do you know what medications I take?" The question stopped him cold. He'd been handling her prescription deliveries for months, monitoring her medical expenses, calculating the cost of her care like line items in a business ledger. But admitting that felt like confessing to another layer of betrayal. Elena mentioned them, he lied, then immediately hated himself for the ease with which deception came. Rose wheeled herself to the window overlooking the river. In the distance, they could see the spot where everything had changed, the dock, the scattered papers that maintenance crews had probably collected by now, the willow branch that had saved her life when her son wouldn't. "Your father proposed to me at that dock," she said quietly. Daniel's hand stilled on the suitcase zipper. "I know. Do you? Or do you just know the story I used to tell at dinner parties?" Rose's reflection in the window glass looked ethereal, ghostly. "The romantic version where he got down on one knee and I said yes immediately." Something in her voice made Daniel look up. "That's not what happened." "What changed your mind?" "Your father got sick. Just a fever, nothing serious, but he was alone in that big house with no one to take care of him. I brought him soup." Rose's fingers traced the wheelchair's armrest absently. "He was so grateful, so vulnerable. He said he didn't want money or status or any of the things I thought he wanted. He just wanted someone to come home to, someone who would worry about him when he was late, someone who would make soup when he got sick." Daniel felt something twist in his chest. "That sounds romantic." It was a lie. The words hit like a slap. Rose's eyes found his, and for the first time since the river, he saw real anger there, not at him, but at something much older and deeper. Not intentional, perhaps. Your father believed his own story, but after we married, after you and Sarah were born, the truth came out. He didn't want a partner, he wanted a manager. Someone to handle the house, raise the children, manage the social obligations while he built his empire. Rose paused, her voice catching slightly. I was so tired of fighting, so grateful to be loved at all, that I became exactly what he needed, instead of who I was. Daniel sank into the suite's overstuffed armchair, feeling like the ground was shifting beneath him. You never seemed unhappy. Because unhappiness was a luxury we couldn't afford. Your father was building something important, something that would secure your future, Sarah's future. My dreams seemed small by comparison. What dreams? Rose wheeled closer, close enough that he could see the fine lines around her eyes, the silver threading through hair that had once been the same dark brown as his own. I wanted to teach literature, maybe writing. I had been accepted to Columbia's graduate program when I met your father. Daniel stared at her. In 38 years, she'd never mentioned this. You never said, when would I have said it? Between driving you to piano lessons and hosting your father's business dinners? Between managing the household staff and organizing charity galas? Rose's voice carried the weight of decades of suppressed resentment. There was no room for what I wanted, Daniel. There was only room for what everyone else needed. But after we grew up, after Sarah moved away, by then, it was too late. Your father's business expanded, required more travel, more entertaining, and Rose's hands clenched in her lap. I developed arthritis, stress-induced, the doctors said. 40 years of sublimating my needs, managing everyone else's lives, carrying emotional labor I was never strong enough to bear alone. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Daniel had always assumed his mother's disability was simply genetic bad luck, the inevitable decline of aging. He'd never considered that it might be the physical manifestation of a lifetime of self-sacrifice. After your father died, Rose continued, her voice growing stronger, I thought maybe there would be time for me, time to discover who I was underneath all those years of being what everyone needed. But then you started visiting more often, started managing my finances, started making suggestions about my living situation, and I realized, what? That you saw me exactly the way your father did, as something to be managed rather than someone to be known. Daniel felt like he was drowning, but this time there was no river, no physical water, just the crushing weight of understanding how thoroughly he'd failed as a human being. I was trying to help. No, Rose said firmly. You were trying to control. There's a difference. I've been reading your father's journals, Rose said quietly. He left them to me along with everything else. Do you know what he wrote about you? Daniel's throat felt like sandpaper. What? That you were becoming like him. Brilliant, successful, driven, and completely incapable of seeing people as anything other than assets or obstacles. Rose reached into her purse and pulled out a leather-bound journal. He was proud of your success, but terrified of what it was costing you. He wrote, Daniel is repeating my mistakes, but without the excuse of not knowing better. He's watched what ambition did to our family, and he's choosing it anyway. The journal felt heavy in Daniel's hands, heavier than its physical weight should have allowed. He opened it to a random page and saw his father's familiar handwriting. Rose gave up everything for me, and I let her. I told myself it was temporary, that success would give us the freedom to pursue her dreams later, but later never came. I kept taking, and she kept giving, until there was nothing left of the woman I fell in love with. God help me, Daniel is doing the same thing, taking from everyone around him and calling it love. Someone needs to stop this cycle before it destroys another generation. Daniel closed the journal, his hands shaking. When did he write this? 2 weeks before his heart attack. He was planning to talk to you about it. About slowing down, about what really mattered, about learning from his mistakes instead of repeating them. The room felt too small, too warm, too full of truths Daniel wasn't ready to process. He stood abruptly, pacing to the window where the eagle still kept its vigil. "So what now?" he asked. "You've told me what a monster I am, what a monster he was. You've explained why you hate me. What's the point?" Rose wheeled her chair closer, and when she spoke, her voice carried a gentleness that Daniel didn't deserve. "I don't hate you, Daniel. I hate what you've become, but I remember who you were before the world taught you that love was weakness and success was everything." She reached for his hand, and this time he didn't pull away. Her fingers were warm despite everything, despite the river, despite the truth, despite his failures. "The question isn't what I want from you," Rose said. "The question is whether the little boy who painted rocks and fed ducks is still in there somewhere, or if ambition has finally killed him completely." Outside, the eagle spread its wings and cried once, a sound like a challenge, like a last call, like time running out. Have you ever realized that someone you love has become someone you don't recognize? What do you think it takes to find your way back to who you used to be? Let us know in the comments. The journal lay open between them on the small table like a bridge neither had expected to find. Daniel's hands trembled as he turned the pages, each entry revealing layers of his father's regret that felt like looking into a mirror that showed not just his present, but his future. Today Rose mentioned wanting to audit a literature class at the community college. I said we couldn't afford the time away from hosting the Henderson dinner party. The light went out of her eyes so quickly I almost apologized. Almost, but the deal was too important, and I told myself her dreams could wait another month. They've been waiting 20 years. "He saw it," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. "He knew what he was doing to you, and he kept doing it anyway." Rose wheeled her chair closer to the window, where the last light of evening painted everything in shades of gold and regret. "Your father was a good man who made selfish choices. He loved us, but he loved success more. He told himself it was for us, but..." She trailed off, watching the river flow past with the same inevitability as time itself. "But it was for him," Daniel finished. "Just like everything I've done has been for me, even when I told myself it was about taking care of you." Yes, the simple acknowledgement hit harder than anger would have. Daniel closed the journal and moved to the window beside her, close enough to see his reflection overlapping with hers in the glass. Two faces that shared the same eyes, the same stubborn chin, the same genetic inheritance of pain. "I used to write," he said suddenly, the words escaping before he could stop them. Rose turned to look at him, surprise flickering across her features. "What?" "In college. I wrote short stories, submitted them to literary magazines. Got a few published in small journals." Daniel's laugh was self-deprecating. "I thought maybe I'd write the great American novel, teach creative writing somewhere quiet, have a simple life where the biggest decision was whether to use a semicolon or a period." "What happened?" "Dad happened. Senior year, he had that first heart episode, not the one that killed him, the smaller one. He called me home. Said he needed help with the business, that it was just temporary until he got back on his feet." Daniel pressed his palm against the cool glass. "I told myself I was being noble, sacrificing my dreams to help family. But the truth is, I was scared. Scared of being poor, scared of failing, scared of not being important." Rose reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing against his wrist. "Writing doesn't make you unimportant." "You were never ordinary, Daniel. Even as a child, you had this intensity, this need to excel at everything. It wasn't necessarily bad. It made you a wonderful student, a talented athlete, a loving brother when Sarah was struggling. The mention of his sister sent a pang through Daniel's chest. Sarah, who lived 3 states away and called once a month out of duty rather than affection. Another relationship sacrificed on the altar of his ambition. Sarah hates me too, doesn't she? Sarah doesn't hate you. She's disappointed in you. There's a difference. Rose's voice carried the gentle authority of someone who'd spent decades translating between her children's hurts and hopes. She sees what I see. A man who forgot that love is supposed to make you want to give, not take. Daniel sank into the chair across from her, suddenly exhausted. I don't know how to give anymore. I look at a situation and immediately calculate what I can get from it, how it benefits me. It's like I rewired my brain for transaction instead of connection. Then we'll have to rewire it back. The simple confidence in her voice made him look up. We? Rose smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since before the river. You think you're the only one who needs to learn? I spent 40 years teaching myself to be invisible, to need nothing, to give everything. I don't know how to ask for what I want anymore. I don't even know what I want. You wanted to teach. That was 30 years ago. Now I want, Rose paused, considering. I want to matter to someone in a way that isn't about what I can do for them. I want to have a conversation about books, about ideas, about something other than medical appointments and household management. I want to feel like a person instead of a caretaker who ran out of people to care for. The admission hung between them, vulnerable and raw. Daniel felt something loosen in his chest, some tight knot of self-protection finally beginning to unravel. I have books, he said quietly. In my apartment, first editions. Mostly, I buy them because they're valuable, not because I read them, but some are books I loved once, before I stopped having time for anything that didn't generate profit. What kind of books? Poetry, mostly. Frost, Dickinson, some contemporary voices. I used to memorize poems, recite them when I couldn't sleep. Daniel felt heat rise in his cheeks. God, I sound like a pretentious asshole. You sound like someone who had dreams once. Rose's voice was soft with something that might have been pride. Do you remember any of them? The poems? Daniel closed his eyes, reaching back through years of buried sensitivity. Slowly, hesitantly, words began to surface. 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both. And be one traveler. Long I stood, and looked down one as far as I could. Robert Frost, Rose murmured. The road not taken. I used to think it was about choosing the harder path, being different, being special. Daniel opened his eyes to find his mother watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. But now I think it's about regret. About the lives we don't live because we're too afraid to step off the path everyone expects us to follow. Maybe, Rose said, or maybe it's about the possibility that it's never too late to choose a different road. Outside, the eagle had disappeared. But something in the quality of light suggested it hadn't gone far. Daniel felt a strange sense of being watched, evaluated, judged by forces beyond his understanding. But for the first time since the river, the judgment didn't feel entirely damning. Mom, he said. The word feeling foreign after months of formal mother. Yes? I'm sorry. Not just for today, for the river, for, he gestured helplessly. For all of it, for becoming someone you don't recognize, for making you feel invisible, for being exactly the kind of man Dad warned me not to become. Rose reached across the small space between them and took his hand. Her grip was stronger than he'd expected, warm and sure and surprisingly comforting. I know, she said simply. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Before he could answer, she squeezed his hand and smiled, a smile that held decades of love alongside the pain, hope alongside the disappointment. "Now," she said, "tell me about these books of yours. And maybe, if you remember any more poems, you could share them with someone who's forgotten what it feels like to hear beautiful words spoken aloud. What dreams did you give up in pursuit of success? Do you think it's ever too late to reconnect with the person we used to be? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your stories." 3 days had passed in careful healing. 3 days of shared meals, tentative conversations, and poetry recited in the soft light of early morning. Daniel had called his office only twice, both times stepping into the hallway so as not to disturb Rose while she read. She'd been working through a collection of Mary Oliver poems he'd brought from his apartment, her fingers tracing the margins where he'd made notes years ago. It felt like progress. It felt like hope. It felt like a lie. Rose discovered the truth while Daniel was in the shower, his phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand. She'd intended to simply silence it, a gesture of consideration she would have never presumed to make a week ago. The phone slipped from Rose's numb fingers, clattering onto the hardwood floor. She stared at it as if it were a venomous snake, her mind struggling to process what she'd just read. Competency hearing. Power of attorney. As discussed. The shower was still running, Daniel's voice carrying through the bathroom door as he hummed something that might have been frost stopping by woods on a snowy evening, a poem he'd shared with her just that morning, his eyes soft with what she'd believed was genuine remorse. Rose's hands shook as she retrieved the phone, scrolling through the message thread with the methodical precision of someone documenting evidence for a trial. The conversation went back weeks, long before the river, long before their tentative reconciliation. "Daniel, she's not incompetent, stubborn maybe, but her mind is sharp. Marcus, doesn't matter. Appearance is what counts. Judge sees elderly woman in wheelchair, hears about unsafe living conditions. It's a done deal. You get full control of assets and care decisions. Daniel, I don't like it. Marcus, you don't have to like it. You just have to inherit clocks ticking, Danny. Every month she stays in that house is money down the drain." The thread continued for dozens of messages, a careful orchestration of legal maneuvers designed to strip Rose of her autonomy while maintaining Daniel's public image as a devoted son. The most recent exchanges were from yesterday, while she'd been reading Mary Oliver, while he'd been reciting poetry, while she'd been foolish enough to believe in the possibility of redemption. "Daniel, something's changed. I need more time." "Marcus, changed how? We've been planning this for months." "Marcus, Danny, you pushed your mother into a river 3 days ago. You think a few heart-to-heart chats are going to fix that? She's a liability. Handle it before she handles you." Rose set the phone down with trembling hands, her chest tight with the familiar ache of betrayal. But this hurt was different from the physical shock of the river. This was the deeper wound of understanding that every moment of the past 3 days had been contaminated by calculation. The shower stopped. Rose wheeled herself to the window, positioning her chair so she faced away from the bathroom door. Outside, the eagle perched on its familiar branch, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she found herself grateful for its presence. At least something in this world was exactly what it appeared to be. "Morning, Mom." Daniel's voice carried the warmth that had almost convinced her he was healing. "Did you sleep well?" Rose didn't turn around. "Your phone rang." She heard him moving behind her, probably reaching for the device, probably seeing Marcus's messages, probably calculating his next move in the elaborate chess game he'd been playing all along. The silence stretched like a held breath. "Mom, don't." The word came out sharper than she'd intended, but she didn't soften it. "Please don't say whatever carefully crafted explanation you're preparing. It's not what it looks like." Rose laughed. a sound devoid of humor that seemed to echo off the hotel room's walls. No? Then explain to me what competency hearing means. Explain power of attorney. Explain how your business partner knows about a legal strategy you've been planning for months, while I've been sitting here believing you might actually be sorry for what you did. Daniel's reflection appeared in the window behind hers, his hair still damp from the shower, his expression a mixture of panic and guilt that might have moved her a week ago. Now it just looked like another performance. The legal stuff, that was before. Before we talked, before I understood, before you realized that cooperation might be easier than coercion. Rose kept her voice level, almost conversational. Tell me, Daniel, when you were reciting those beautiful poems, when you were sharing your dreams about writing, when you were apologizing so eloquently for becoming someone I didn't recognize, were you genuinely connecting with me, or were you simply adapting your strategy? Both, Daniel whispered, and the honesty of it was somehow worse than any lie could have been. Rose closed her eyes, feeling something break inside her chest, not her heart, which had been damaged too many times to shatter completely, but something more fundamental. Her faith in the possibility that people could change, that love could triumph over greed, that her son might still exist somewhere beneath the cold calculation that had replaced him. "Get out," she said quietly. "Mom, please. Let me explain." Daniel's face crumpled, and for a moment he looked like the 7-year-old boy who'd cried when he'd accidentally broken her favorite vase. "I don't know how to stop," he whispered. "I don't know how to be anything other than what I've become." "Then that's your choice," Rose said, her voice steady, despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "But I won't be your victim anymore. I won't be your project or your burden or your pathway to financial freedom. I won't be managed or manipulated or pushed aside for your convenience." She wheeled past him toward the phone, her movements sharp and decisive. "I'm calling Elena to pick me up. You can tell Marcus Webb to proceed with whatever legal proceedings he thinks will work. But understand this, I will fight you. I will hire the best lawyers my money can buy, and yes, Daniel, it's still my money, and I will make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of man you are." Daniel stood frozen in the middle of the room, watching his mother pack the few belongings she'd brought. "Where will you go? That's no longer your concern. But your care, your medications, your safety." Rose stopped packing and looked at him with an expression that made his blood freeze. "My safety? My son, who pushed me into a river, is concerned about my safety." Outside, the eagle spread its wings and released a cry that sounded like judgment finally rendered. Daniel looked toward the window, and for one impossible moment, he would have sworn the bird was looking directly at him with eyes that held the weight of cosmic disappointment. When he turned back, Rose was already at the door, her bag balanced on her lap, her hand on the handle. "Mom," he said desperately, "I love you." Rose paused without turning around. "No," she said quietly. "You love what I represent. My approval, my assets, my role in the story you tell yourself about being a good son. But me, the person I actually am? You stopped seeing her years ago." Daniel sank onto the bed, his father's journal open beside him to an entry he'd read dozen times. "The worst part isn't that I hurt the people I love. It's that I convinced myself it was love while I was doing it." Through the window, the eagle circled once and disappeared into the gray morning sky, leaving Daniel alone with the wreckage of every chance he'd been given and thrown away. Have you ever discovered that someone's apology was just another form of manipulation? How do you know when someone is genuinely changing versus just adapting their tactics? Let us know in the comments below. The hotel room felt like a tomb after Rose left. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed for 2 hours, staring at the indentation in the carpet where her wheelchair had been, listening to the silence that pressed against his eardrums like accusation itself. His phone buzzed repeatedly, Marcus with updates, his assistant with scheduling conflicts, clients with demands that had seemed urgent just days ago and now felt meaningless as smoke. He ignored them all. By noon, Daniel found himself standing in the hotel parking lot, his car keys heavy in his hand. He could drive home, return to his penthouse, activate the legal machinery that would strip his mother of her autonomy and deliver him the inheritance he'd convinced himself he needed. Marcus was right. The competency hearing was a formality, the papers already drawn, the outcome predetermined by a system that saw elderly disability as automatic incompetence. It would be easy, clean, final. Instead, Daniel found himself driving to Riverside Cemetery, where his father rested beneath a granite headstone that read "Beloved Husband and Father," words that felt like mockery now that Daniel understood the man they supposedly honored. The grave was well maintained, the grass neatly trimmed, the flowers fresh. Daniel knelt beside the headstone, his expensive suit soaking up moisture from the damp earth, and spoke to the silence. "She read your journals, Dad. All of them. Every regret, every moment you knew you were choosing wrong, and did it anyway." His voice cracked. "I thought I was building on your legacy, but I was just repeating your mistakes. Except worse, because I knew better, and I chose this anyway." The wind stirred the trees overhead, and for a moment, Daniel could have sworn he heard his father's voice. "It's not too late to choose differently." "Isn't it?" Daniel whispered. "I pushed her into a river. I spent 3 days manipulating her, while planning to have her declared incompetent. What kind of man does that to his own mother? The kind of man who can still choose to be better." Daniel pressed his palms against the cold granite, feeling something break open in his chest, not the calculated emotion he'd performed in the hotel room, but something raw and real and utterly uncontrolled. He wept for the first time since his father's funeral, wept for the son he'd been and the man he'd become, wept for every choice that had led him to this moment of absolute moral bankruptcy. When the tears finally stopped, Daniel pulled out his phone and scrolled to Marcus Webb's contact. His finger hovered over the number for a long moment before he pressed call. "Stop," Daniel interrupted. "Cancel everything. The hearing, the papers, all of it." Silence stretched across the connection. "Then what do you mean, cancel?" "I mean, it's over, Marcus. I'm not pursuing guardianship. I'm not contesting her autonomy. I'm dropping the entire thing." "Have you lost your mind? We're talking about $12 million, Danny. $12 million that's just sitting there while your mother plays house in that mansion. Every month she stays independent is money down the drain." "It's her money," Daniel said, the words feeling strange but true in his mouth. "Her house, her choice. Jesus Christ, 3 days ago you were ready to push her down the stairs if it would speed up the inheritance. What happened?" The casual cruelty of the statement hit Daniel like a physical blow. Was that really how he'd sounded? How he'd appeared to his closest business associate? A man so consumed by greed that attempted murder seemed like a reasonable business strategy. "I happened," Daniel said quietly. "I finally saw what I'd become." Daniel hung up and immediately blocked the number. Then he scrolled through his contacts, finding and calling his lawyer, his accountant, every professional who'd been complicit in his plan to strip his mother of her dignity. One by one, he canceled their services, terminated their contracts, burned the bridges that led back to the man he'd been. By sunset, Daniel sat in his car outside the mansion where he'd grown up, where Rose had returned after leaving the hotel. Elena's car was in the driveway, and lights glowed warm and golden in the windows, the same windows he'd calculated the value of, the same rooms he'd mentally emptied and sold. His phone rang. Sarah. "Elena called me," his sister said without preamble. She said, "Mom came home upset that something happened at the hotel. Daniel, what did you do?" The question hung between them like a bridge he could either cross or burn. For a moment, Daniel considered lying, crafting some story that would preserve his image as the devoted son managing a difficult situation. But he was tired of lies, tired of manipulation, tired of being the kind of man who thought love was a transaction. "I tried to have her declared incompetent," he said, "so I could gain control of her assets. And when she found out, Sarah, I think I may have lost her forever." Sarah's sharp intake of breath carried 3 states worth of distance. "My God, Daniel, what is wrong with you?" "I don't know," he whispered. "But I want to fix it. I want to be better. I want to be the brother you remember, the son she deserves. I just don't know if it's too late." "Maybe," Sarah said after a long pause. "But maybe not. The question is, are you actually sorry, or are you just sorry you got caught?" Daniel looked up at the mansion, at the window where his mother's silhouette moved across the curtains. She was probably reading, probably trying to lose herself in someone else's words, because her own story had become too painful to bear. "I'm sorry I became someone capable of hurting her," he said. "I'm sorry I chose money over love so many times that I forgot the difference. I'm sorry Dad died before I could tell him I understood his regrets. And I'm sorry I waited until I'd lost everything to realize what everything actually meant." Sarah was quiet for so long that Daniel wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, "What are you going to do about it?" Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, something he'd written in the hotel room after Rose left, something he'd carried to his father's grave and back again. "I'm going to give her a choice," he said. An hour later, Daniel approached the mansion's front door, not with his key, which would have been presumptuous, but as a visitor seeking permission to enter. Elena answered, her expression guarded but not entirely hostile. "She doesn't want to see you," Elena said gently. "I know, but could you give her this?" Daniel held out the letter, his hands steady, despite the magnitude of what it contained. "Tell her she doesn't have to read it now, or ever. Tell her I'll respect whatever decision she makes. But tell her that everything in there is true, and that I love her enough to let her go if that's what she needs." Elena took the letter, studying Daniel's face with the careful assessment of someone who'd spent years protecting Rose from disappointment. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied some test, because she nodded. "Yes? If this is another manipulation, if you're playing some deeper game, I will make sure she never has to see you again. Do you understand?" "I understand," Daniel said. "And Elena, thank you for taking care of her when I forgot how." As he walked back to his car, Daniel caught sight of movement in the oak tree at the property's edge. The eagle perched there in the gathering darkness, its golden eyes fixed on him with an intelligence that felt like judgment deferred but not dismissed. The eagle spread its wings once, as if in acknowledgement, then settled back to wait. Inside the mansion, Rose sat by the window with Daniel's letter unopened in her lap, facing the most important choice of her life, whether to risk her heart one final time on the possibility that love could triumph over the wreckage of betrayal. When someone has hurt you deeply, how do you know if their apology is genuine? What would it take for you to give someone a second chance after they'd broken your trust? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Rose held the letter for 3 hours before opening it. Elena's gentle presence, the only thing anchoring her to the moment as twilight deepened outside her window. When she finally broke the seal, her name was written across the front in Daniel's careful script, Mom, not Mother or Mrs. Harrington, but the simple word he'd called her before the world taught him that love was a liability. "Dear Mom, I don't know if you'll read this, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know what I've chosen, and why. But that's not the real letter I want to write. The real letter is this. I remember being 7 years old, standing by the river with a painted rock in my hands, so proud that I'd found something beautiful to give you. You kept that rock on your kitchen windowsill for 15 years, until it finally cracked from age and weather. When I asked why you'd kept something so ordinary for so long, you said, "Because you gave it to me with love, and love makes everything precious." I forgot that lesson somewhere along the way. I started believing that precious meant expensive, that valuable meant profitable, that love was something you earned through achievement rather than something you gave freely. I turned our relationship into a transaction, and I turned you into an obstacle between me and my inheritance. I pushed you into that river because I'd convinced myself you were standing in the way of my future. But you weren't standing in the way, you were the future. You were the only thing that mattered, and I was too blind to see it. I've been reading Dad's journals every night since you showed them to me. He wrote something that keeps haunting me. The saddest thing about success is how it teaches you to measure love in dollars and relationships in terms of utility. By the time you realize what you've lost, the people who loved you unconditionally are either gone or too tired to keep trying. I don't want to be too late, Mom. I want to learn how to give instead of take. I want to discover who I am when I'm not calculating what I can get from every interaction. I want to matter to you in a way that isn't about what I can do for you or what you can do for me. So here's what I'm proposing, not as your son who expects anything, but as a person who owes you more than he can ever repay. I want to help you pursue your dreams. The real ones, the ones you gave up for Dad and for us kids. I want to enroll you in that literature program at Columbia if you're still interested, or help you find something else that makes you feel alive. I want to hire the best tutors, the most accessible transportation, whatever support you need to become the woman you were meant to be before the world convinced you to be smaller. I want to convert the mansion's east wing into a perfect space for you, accessible, beautiful, designed around your needs rather than around what's convenient for everyone else. Or if you'd prefer to travel, to see the world you never got to explore, I want to make that possible too. But most of all, I want to earn the right to call you Mom again, not through money or grand gestures, but through the slow daily work of becoming someone worthy of your love. I know this letter might sound like another manipulation, another strategy designed to get what I want. I know I've forfeited the right to be believed, but I'm enclosing something that I hope will show you I mean every word. All my love, the real kind, the unconditional kind, the kind you taught me before I forgot how to feel it. Daniel. P.S. Look outside your window. Rose's hands trembled as she set the letter aside and wheeled herself to the bay window. In the gathering darkness, she could see Daniel's silhouette by the river, standing exactly where the dock met the shore. But he wasn't alone. A second figure stood beside him, tall, broad-shouldered, unmistakably familiar despite being impossible. Rose's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the posture, the way the man held his shoulders, the gesture of his hand as he placed it on Daniel's shoulder. It had to be a trick of the light, a shadow cast by tree branches, a projection of her desperate hope. But for one impossible moment, Rose could have sworn she saw her husband standing beside their son, both of them silhouettes against the water that had been the site of so much pain and was now, somehow, becoming something else. Elena appeared beside her chair, following her gaze to the river. "What is it, Mrs. Rose? Do you see them? Both of them?" Elena peered into the darkness, then looked at Rose with gentle concern. "I see Daniel. Yes, he's been standing there for hours, just waiting." Rose looked again, and now there was only Daniel, alone by the water, holding something in his hands. As she watched, he knelt and placed whatever he carried at the river's edge, then stepped back with his head bowed. "Elena," Rose said quietly, "would you help me get to the river?" The path to the water was rough. unsuitable for a wheelchair, but Elena was strong and determined, and Rose was lighter than she appeared. Together they made their way down the slope as the first stars appeared overhead. Daniel looked up as they approached, his face streaked with tears he hadn't bothered to hide. "I didn't know if you'd come," he said. "What did you leave there?" Rose nodded toward the river's edge, where something glinted in the moonlight. Daniel's smile was sad and real and completely without calculation. "A painted rock. I found it this morning in Dad's study, the one I gave you when I was 7. He must have saved it when it cracked." Rose felt her heart constrict with a pain that was somehow also healing. "And you brought it back to the river?" "I brought it back to where I learned what love meant the first time. Before I forgot. Before I—" Daniel gestured helplessly at the water. "I thought maybe if I put it back where the lesson started, I could learn it again." Above them, the eagle appeared one final time, circling once in the starlight before settling on the oak branch that overhung the water. Its cry pierced the night, not the harsh sound of judgment Daniel had heard before, but something that sounded almost like blessing. Rose reached for her son's hand, and this time when their fingers touched, there was no calculation, no manipulation, no agenda beyond the simple need for connection. Daniel knelt beside her wheelchair, his expensive suit forgotten, his corporate armor finally abandoned. "I want to write again. I want to teach, maybe. I want to help people find their voices instead of buying and selling things that don't matter. And I want to audit that literature class," Rose said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I want to read books that challenge me, have conversations about ideas that matter, maybe even try writing something myself." "We could do it together," Daniel said tentatively. "If you wanted, I could drive you to classes, we could study together, debate the books we're reading." "As equals," Rose said firmly. "Not as caregiver and patient, not as manager and managed. As two people who love each other enough to help each other grow." "As equals," Daniel agreed. They sat by the river as the night deepened around them, mother and son, two people who had lost each other in the maze of expectation and fear, and had somehow found their way back to love. The painted rock glimmered in the shallows, a talisman of second chances and the possibility that it's never too late to choose differently. The eagle watched over them until dawn, then spread its wings and disappeared into the morning sky, its work finally complete. 6 months later, Rose published her first short story in a small literary magazine, a piece about forgiveness and the courage required to change. Daniel's business had downsized dramatically as he shifted his focus from acquisition to education, but his bank account's diminishment had been matched by his soul's expansion. Every Sunday they met by the river to read together, to share what they'd learned, to remember that love, real love, isn't about what you can get from someone, but about who you become when you choose to give freely. And sometimes, when the light hit the water just right, they both could have sworn they saw the eagle circling overhead, an eternal witness to the truth that even the most broken bonds can be mended when people choose love over fear, connection over control, and the messy beauty of authentic relationship over the hollow perfection of transaction. What second chances have you given or received that changed your life? How do you think families can heal from deep betrayal and find their way back to genuine love? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might inspire someone else who's struggling to rebuild broken relationships.
Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey of redemption and healing. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe for more stories that explore the complex depths of human relationships and the transformative power of love. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Thank you for watching this story to the end.